Assalamualaikum, Ida.
How are you, Prof. Jomo?
Fine, thank you.
You look well?
You look very well.
Alhamdulillah.
You have a very beautiful hijab.
Oh, no. It's always nice to wear a red scarf. At least it's clearer and visible and everybody can see that. What about Dr. Khor? Are you okay?
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm well, thank you, Prof. Ida.
That's a beautiful batik shirt.
Thank you very much. Captain Batik, still Malaysian.
All right. Is that your nickname, Captain Batik?
No, I mean the name of the shop that I bought this from is Captain Batik.
Oh, really? That's the brand.
Yeah.
That's good. That's new. At least
I'm
I
also
know
wearing
I learned
batik.
something new today. Oh, beautiful.
Beautiful,
Munirah.
Thank you.
Very nice, Munirah.
Assalamualaikum, Prof. Jomo, Dr. Khor, Dr. Chris, Prof. Ida.
How are you, Dr. Chris?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm feeling like I should go and get my batik shirt now.
Must show your loyalty and nationalism, you see.
I thought it might be too colourful for the screen if I
Yeah, with your background. That's a beautiful background. Red color.
Come corporate colours.
So we've all tested the sound system. It seems to be working well. We will start exactly 2:30 if it's okay to everybody.
All right.
We'll just smile to the screen while waiting.
Okay, now I see it on Facebook. Okay, I'm going to just share this.
Okay. We have about 70 participants who have registered via the Zoom link, but we're hoping to have more coming in. And of course, it's streamed live on Facebook and YouTube. We are now live stream on FB. Maybe we can start with the small chats first.
The latest news.
What is the latest news? Sister
the US's announcement to support the waiver, but only the vaccines is only, like instead of the whole list as proposed.
That's a breaking news, isn't it?
Yeah. So they're having the General Council meeting either today, was it today or tomorrow?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, let's see, because they said it might take a long while before they get through the negotiations with the text. So yeah.
You're talking about the General Council at the WTO.
WTO, yeah.
Yes. They're starting with the text-based negotiation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which makes it more exciting for the pharmaceutical industry.
Mm. It's just just curious because they said like only regarding the vaccines, but then when we're looking at the waiver, they've actually requested for like a waiver on patents, trade secrets, copyrights, and ID. So maybe vaccines as a whole would like kind of like cover like blanket all intellectual properties relating to the vaccines, but we're looking at as well like treatment, right? Containment, prevention, and treatment. So yeah, let's see how things go.
It's going to be more exciting after this. With more developments taking place at international level. I hope it will trickle down to Malaysia.
Yep.
Yeah.
I see quite a few people that I know. I think Helmi, one of my former colleagues, is here. Hi, Helmi. Shout out to you. Hi, Miss Sanya. Prof. Jomo, Miss Sanya is already in as well.
Hi.
Oh, okay. Hello.
Hi, Sanya.
Hi.
Is it cold in Australia still?
I'm actually in Switzerland, in Geneva.
Oh, nice.
Not snowing.
Place. Nice place. I wish I'm there.
The food is not as good as Malaysia, that's for sure.
Yeah.
In Ramadan especially, yeah.
Yeah.
But since everybody is ready, maybe we can start just officially, all right? Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya wa mursalin. Alhamdulillah, thumma alhamdulillah, thumma alhamdulillah. Welcome everybody to this important webinar on intellectual property rights and pandemic, WTO TRIPS IP waiver. It has taken quite some time to organize and arrange this webinar. And so it was quite surprising that over the weekend we managed to get it done and roll it out just in a couple of few days. Just to give a bit of background to our audience today, what the discussion is all about, let me just read the narratives which were appearing all in the internet, right? So that whatever I'm saying here is basically the true narration. I'm not concocting it. So the question of suspending IP rights for COVID-19 treatments and vaccines was first tabled by India and South Africa in a proposal to the World Trade Organization, or WTO, which was backed by around 100 other countries. According to the proponents, an IP waiver for vaccine parents could speed up vaccine access in poorer countries. Now, what type of waiver are we looking at? The waiver would cover obligations in 4 sections of the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, or TRIPS agreement. For the sake of the audience who have little knowledge on TRIPS agreement, it's one of the agreement which was negotiated, concluded, and administered by the World Trade Organization, and it's one of the premier intellectual property agreement in the world. Now, the waiver would involve copyright and related rights, industrial designs, patents, and the protection of undisclosed information. When the proposal started, it was quite controversial, but as you know, last night there was breakthrough news that US government, led by President Joe Biden, has actually backed the IP waiver, and soon after that, New Zealand also backed the IP waiver. So this is a very important and urgent issue that needs to be discussed as we are grappling with COVID-19, and we are actually having this war against COVID-19. There was no such important or serious war that we've had since so many years. Now we are very honored to have with us our esteemed panelists, Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, who is a fellow of the Academy of Science, Malaysia, emeritus professor at University of Malaya. He was UN Assistant Secretary General for Economic Development and received the 2007 Wesley, I can't even pronounce it, okay? Wesley something, Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought. He's also a visiting fellow at the Initiative for Policy Dialogue, Columbia University. And most important thing, he is a visiting professor at International Islamic University, Malaysia, which is my university. Right, together with him, we have Dr. Chris Hemingway. Dr. Chris is a director of the local office of the Marks and Clerk Group, the largest specialist international firm of patent and trademark attorneys in the world. He specializes in the drafting and prosecution of patent applications. The third panelist will be Dr. Swee Khor, a Malaysian physician with international experience in the public, private, non-profit, and think tank sectors. Currently, he specializes in health policies and global health, holding fellowships at Chatham House, the United Nations University, and ISIS Malaysia. And last but not least, our own Munirah Maarof, an alumni of IIUM. She leads the General Corporate and Commercial Department of Tan Norizan and Associates. She specializes in intellectual property as an IP lawyer, also as a certified intangible asset valuer. She is currently a committee member of the Property Surveying Division, Royal Institution of Surveyors, Malaysia. She is also a member of the Malaysian Intellectual Property Association of Malaysia. Now, the way I will conduct this webinar is that I will ask 2 rounds of questions. I will throw 2 rounds of questions. The first round of questions will be answered or responded by the panelists, and each will be given 7 minutes each. After the first round is over, we will collect questions from the audience before we move to the second round, which the panelists will also be given around 5 to 7 minutes each. And after the end of the second round, we will collect more questions from the audience. I was hoping to get more questions from the audience to make this more interactive. That would make it more fun than anything. Now I will start with Prof. Jomo. Now, Prof. Jomo, given the gap in vaccination and the widespread practice of vaccine nationalism, what is your view on this proposal for IP waiver currently being negotiated at WTO? Do you think that this is the best way forward to scale up production of vaccines to supply to the whole world? Yes, Prof. Jomo.
Thank you very much, Professor Ida. Assalamu alaikum and salam Ramadan to all viewers, and thank you very much to those of you who initiated the organization of this panel. I know it has been quite challenging to put it together, and I do hope that it will yield and contribute to the discussion which is going on throughout the world. It was a pleasure 2 nights ago to listen to the former president of Switzerland, a country which is also very heavily invested in the IP business, as far as concerned, where Madame Dreyfus basically expressed her very strong opposition to the resistance to the waiver. And I think it is very commendable. Now, in many ways, the developments last night has overtaken events to some extent. As you know, President Biden and US Trade Representative Catherine Tai have made clear that the US is dropping its opposition to the waiver. This opposition had been very clear in earlier meetings, but at the last meeting, and especially at yesterday's meeting, very clear that the US is no longer opposed to the waiver. However, it is not opposed to the waiver as far as vaccines are concerned. And I do think it is very important for the US to make clear its position on the original waiver request from South Africa as well as from India. The original waiver request is very limited. Okay, it's very limited. It is limited to the tests, the treatments, the vaccines, as well as to personal protective equipment relating to COVID-19 pandemic, and it's only for the duration of the pandemic. Okay, we have to be very clear about the waiver request being very modest, very limited, and very specific. I think it is also important for us to remember to note that it is ambiguous whether the US will lift its opposition to this. This is not a trivial issue because many countries, as we know, are not able to even do testing to ascertain the number of people who may be infected. And this, of course, adversely affects the ability to contain the contagion, which has had a tremendous effect. Just to give you some indication about the likely effects of the delay in vaccination due to non-resolution of this problem of access to vaccines alone, okay? I'm leaving aside the questions of lack of delayed access to the other elements which have been requested. This delay is estimated by the WHO projections to cause an additional, I want to emphasize, an additional 2.5 million deaths. The number of people who are likely to be infected will of course greatly exceed this, and the other implications as far as economic and other disruptions are also going to be very, very considerable. So the stakes involved are very serious, and I think it is increasingly recognized that unless we contain this pandemic at the world level, it threatens everybody throughout the world. So I think it is very important to recognize that, that while there is, in a sense, a selfish character to this, in terms of vaccine nationalism, there is also an element of the common good. Okay. Now, what we have seen, of course, is that there have been delays in testing, delays in treatment, and huge lapses and gaps in testing and treatment, as well as the ability of frontline workers to protect themselves because of unaffordable equipment. This is a problem, particularly among developing countries. Conversely, we find that the rich countries have generally overbooked the vaccines which they needed, and we have seen, for example, countries such as Australia and Canada overbooking by a multiple of 5. In other words, getting a booking for 5 times what they actually need. And as conversely, we have seen many countries, including, I must add, some rich countries who have actually found themselves kicked to the bottom of the line. We find, for example, that Pfizer has just announced that the vaccines to be sold to the European Union will increase in price by 60%. Pfizer earlier this week announced a significant increase in sales revenue and a significant increase in projected profits, which of course has affected its share price and so on and so forth. All this have huge implications and basically remind us of what is at stake. We are talking about essentially about the greed, which is monopolizing. I think anybody, you don't have to study any economics to know that the monopoly allows the companies who control these products concerned to determine the prices. And in the US, which is the single largest producer of many of these products, we find that there are no laws against price gouging. Only 5 years ago, Loretta Lynch, who should be commended in Malaysia because of her role in bringing 1MDB to book, Loretta Lynch initiated actions against a young man named Mr. Martin Shkreli, who had bought over a patent and had increased the price of the patent by 60 times, okay, by 6,000%. There are other instances. In Malaysia, for example, we have a patent for hepatitis C, which would cost, where the treatment for a 12-week treatment would cost close to 300,000 ringgit, whereas the generic equivalent, which is bought with the assistance of a Egyptian company, costs 1,300 ringgit. So we are talking about huge rents which are obtained simply by the ability of companies to secure patents. But I want to, because my time is running out, let me emphasize one other element which is very important, that this is only the first step, because we have a situation where there is not a single company which has signed up to C-Act, which is the WHO initiative for ensuring access to technologies involved. This is especially important because it is often claimed, wrongly I must emphasize, that developing countries do not have the capacity, do not have the ability to produce these vaccines. This is something which unfortunately Mr. Bill Gates has said, and many other people repeat ad nauseum, but there is no basis in fact. I want to remind you that developing countries have not been exactly lagging behind in terms of pharmaceutical development and in terms of medical developments as well. The first heart transplant in the world was actually conducted in South Africa in 1967 by Dr. Christian Barnard, and so on and so forth. So I think it is important for us to recognize, I would admit that more than 80 countries which have produced vaccines may not be able to produce this particular vaccine because of its special characteristics. But the reluctance to share this technology is going to be the next big stumbling block in ensuring global access to the vaccines. And I would say that this has a huge human cost. I think Malaysians should also be proud that Malaysian-based NGOs such as Third World Network, I wish Miss Sanya Smith would be able to share her legal knowledge of many of the complex issues involved as far as this is concerned. But I think it is very important for us to recognize that there is much to do, still to be done in order to ensure vaccine access. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jomo. He has started the discussion on a very strong note, and he has mentioned words like monopoly, technological gap, pricing, and quite a lot of very serious issues that concerns the equitable access to vaccine. Now, my next question is to Dr. Chris Hemingway. Now, given that in this pandemic, everybody says that the only thing that can pull us out from this problem is innovation. And given that pharmaceutical companies have spent money, effort, and time in developing these essential medicines to fight this pandemic, how do you view this proposal? What do you think of this proposal? Is this the best way to pull us out from this COVID-19 pandemic? Yes, Chris.
Thanks, Prof. Ada, and thanks for inviting me to speak at this seminar with so many eminent speakers here. I think before I answer the question, I'd just like to say that we handle IP for both pharmaceutical manufacturers and also generic manufacturers. So we don't have a particular affiliation to either. So I'm really looking at this, I'm trying to look at this from an unbiased perspective from the point of view of IP. One of the things that we come across really is that there are a number of concerns with the waiver. So I think Prof. Jomo just mentioned there that I wrote some notes. He said that the waiver was limited, modest, and specific. Well, I'm not sure it is, to be honest. I think when you look at the wording of the waiver, it carves out large sections of TRIPS to the extent that it covers patents, industrial designs, and trade secrets. And if you consider what might happen if there was no IP, there's some discussion to say that if you don't have IP, then if for example, a pharmaceutical didn't produce a patent or didn't use a patent, but then there would be no requirement to share or publish their work. Whereas at least with the patent system, after 18 months, all patents are published. One of the cornerstones of the patent system is that in new developments are based on existing innovations. If you go back a few hundred years, a lot of trade secrets were dying out. This was kind of, in the mechanical era, and secrets were passed from father to son. But then if there was no business to continue, quite often the developments that had been made in those industries were then lost subsequently. And I think there's some concern that if the same could happen with patents, and the pharmaceuticals, if there is no vaccine patented now, if there was no vaccine patent, if you then had a second pandemic in a few years' time, what happens to that knowledge? You don't have anything to build on. You'd be starting from scratch potentially. Secondly, with with the pharmaceuticals producing this information, though, it's not just a question of what's published, but also I think you need the know-how. This is not a simple recipe where, particularly with the new technology like the mRNA vaccines, this is not such like a simple recipe where anyone can scale them up. There is also some concern that if with safety of third-party vaccines, if there is some data to suggest that while the innovators themselves, the pharmaceutical companies, are often taken to task about tainting of drugs or not meeting safety standards. I accept that there are some issues with that, but when you measure the standards, the corresponding standards in India and China, there are twice as many problems. And I think that's why it's important to some extent to have some sort of a license agreement. Now, the licensing agreement in TRIPS allows third parties under certain conditions to use the technology of a third party like a pharmaceutical. I think we're going to cover this a bit later, so I won't say too much now, but quite a lot of the restrictions I think are can be overcome in certain situations like health emergencies, for example. There is also some issue that the TRIPS only allows these provisions to take place for domestic use. And I think this is one of the ways that actually the waiver could be improved by not being so broad, but perhaps being a bit more selective in the way it works. So instead of broadly disallowing patents and industrial designs and trade secrets, we look at a specific part of it to limit the effect. Because I think my concern is if the waiver goes ahead, it's not necessarily it's not necessarily so much of an issue now, but for a future pandemic. And I think even if it goes ahead now, I think you need the innovators on board to be able to make sure that whatever drugs or equipment is made properly. Without their help, I think there's some concern. I think also Prof Jomo mentioned the issues with developing countries and capacity. There's been some recent statements by the CEO of the Serum Institute of India saying that actually IP isn't the issue for them. It's time and money that they need. You can't just build a factory overnight. You need investment from the Indian government. He said that the profit they make from supplying India isn't enough to support that at the moment. And they need just more time in order to be able to scale up the vaccine. I think my feeling at the moment is, while IP does have a place, I think actually it may benefit the production of vaccines. And the bigger issues are more to do with manufacturing and having the actual production facilities in the first place and the logistics of supplying everyone that needs it. So I think that's about my allotted time. I'll leave it there for now. I think we'll come back to the waiver in a bit
Thank you
later.
very much, Chris.
Thanks.
You've basically highlighted a number of technical problems if the IP waiver is to be supported. Most of these have been repeatedly mentioned, and you can find it on the internet as well. The fact that what about the quality of the products, and the fact that there is already voluntary licensing, which is allowed under TRIPS agreement, and compulsory licensing, which is allowed under the agreement. But I believe from your tone, you basically are saying that the pharmaceutical company is on board in terms of wanting to scale up production and help to alleviate the problem with COVID-19 now. With that, I then move to Dr. Khor. As a public health advocate and health practitioner, do you think IPR has hampered the rollout of essential medicines for the fight against COVID-19? We've heard Dr. Chris mentioning that parent is not the only obstacles. You have to look at supply chain, you have to look at the supply of raw materials and all kinds of other stuff before you can really scale up production up to the point that is needed by the global community. Should we be thinking, do you think that this is a time where urgent solution is needed, that we should not be thinking about profit anymore, but we should be thinking about saving lives? in this pandemic. Yes, Dr. Khor.
Thank you, Prof. Ida. Is it okay that I share my screen for a while?
Sure.
So I just have one slide.
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me just try to do that. Can you see my slide on my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Oh, not like this. Can you see the screen, ladies and gentlemen?
Yes, Dr. Khor, we can see your screen.
Great, thank you. So I'll take the next 10 minutes to try to answer Prof. Ida's questions. This will be the one slide that I'll be using, so I'll mark my time as well. Prof. Ida, you've asked a question. I've kept the question in the top right-hand corner. I hope that people will be able to see the question. And throughout, as we go through these three particular elements of the global health IP landscape, I hope to answer Prof. Ida's questions and also to put some additional comments on the matter. We begin with the facts and statistics in the column, or rather in the box on the left in blue. I'll take you through the history of compulsory licensing. We look at global health today, and we look specifically at the impact of patents on COVID-19. Broadly, I take the position that pharma companies and rich countries can do more in terms of sharing their patents, but patents alone could be not enough. It's too narrow a conversation. I think the conversation can be broader than just patents. So I take the view that more patents should be shared or waived. The outcomes are important to me. And the outcomes, I think we have to keep this in mind, the outcomes are not to get the patent waiver. The outcomes are to get the vaccines, medicines, personal protective equipment, ventilators, and life-saving goods to patients. That's the outcome. The outcome is not getting a patent waiver. The outcome is getting these goods to patients where they need them, whenever they need them. So bearing these outcomes in mind, let's look at the history of compulsory licensing. It actually took effect beginning 1995. The 2001 agreement was actually adding on the public health element for, say, public health emergencies. And the concept of compulsory licensing is managed through WTO, and in the new Director General of the WTO, I think we've got a strong proponent of vaccine patent waivers, and hopefully Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala will be able to do her magic, shall we say, with the leaders around the world. The compulsory licensing provisions inside WTO are infrequently used since 2001. Notable examples are South Africa and India. Malaysia also used it for sofosbuvir, a hepatitis C medicine, in 2017, and this was renewed in 2020. Notably, there was not a lot of opposition. There was some, but not a lot of opposition from the US trade representative from sofosbuvir at that time. Secondly, is to look at the global health, the political economy of global health, and the IP landscape is within the political economy of global health. There is obviously a very strong pharma lobby in Washington and Brussels. There is also a very strong neoliberal economics influence on health financing globally. And I mean this at the global level, also at the national level, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union. Zooming into COVID, as much as $11 billion from the US government alone, and not talking about the governments of Japan and Korea and Singapore and the European Union, just the US government produced $11 billion in funds to fund the COVID vaccine given over to multiple companies. So although there's a neoliberal economics bent to it, it's telling how much public funding is being used. Thirdly, in the impact on COVID-19, the ACT accelerator, or the Access to COVID Tools accelerator, has 4 arms. So I'm pleased that Prof. Jomo has mentioned not only vaccines, but things like personal protective equipment and so on. So the 4 arms of the ACT Accelerator are diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, and health systems connector. Diagnostics means the antigen test kits. Therapeutics means medicines like the dexamethasone, for example, that we're using in some clinical guidelines. And finally, vaccines and a health system connector to, well, connect them all. All of these are subject to patents. The ACT Accelerator does not cover other things like ventilators, oxygen supply. Well, you don't really need a patent for oxygen supply, maybe some of those regulators for oxygen, but some of these inventions have some patents surrounding it as well. You've asked me a question, Prof. Ida, has it hampered? Yes, it has. The restricted IP landscape has hampered the speed of the COVID response. The ways in which it has hampered and the quantum of the hampering, I guess, is still open to question. Some would say it's a very large order of magnitude. Some would say it's a small order of magnitude. I guess researchers are still figuring out the quantum. But regardless of how big or how small the slowness of the hampering is, the fact that patents have hampered the COVID response means there are excellent ethical, moral, legal, and even public health reasons for us to, shall we say, change the patent landscape. And finally, there is a COVID technology access pool, or CTAP, which Prof. Jomo has mentioned as well, but it's got very poor response right now, with very few countries and no companies sharing their patents over there. These are the facts and stats of the global health IP landscape. Let me move on to the analysis, my analysis of the situation. I share three analyses. The first one is to build on what I said earlier, that the patent discussion must serve public health outcomes. It cannot exist in a vacuum or isolation all by itself, because patents are only one piece of the solution to get the outcome. And the outcome is getting all these life-saving public goods to patients in every country in the world whenever healthcare professionals need them. That is the outcome. So even if you're successful in patents, you must still consider other elements like technology transfers, appropriate commercial agreements, production expansion, and so on. So everything that Dr. Hemingway has mentioned earlier, I agree with. So I think the discussion on patents could be a little narrow. Therefore, I'm trying to broaden the conversation a little bit. I propose a few selfish reasons for rich countries and also companies to share patents. But when I say share patents, it's actually share patents, share vaccines, share technology, share resources, share everything in this effort for global solidarity. I begin with the clear ethical, moral, public health, economic, and political reasons for sharing. The National Bureau of Economic Research in America estimated that rich countries will have their economy suffer or rather lose up to 2.6 trillion US dollars if they don't share vaccines and technology. And there's a very compelling economic reason for them to share. But if that's not enough, I will share a few selfish reasons. Firstly, in the middle of the screen over here, donations cost rich countries nothing. Countries like Canada and Switzerland are 5 to 9 times surplus of vaccines, right? And these vaccines have an expiry date. If you share these vaccines and donate them, it costs rich countries nothing. Big Pharma also has almost no cost if they were to share their patents or to waive their patents or whatever the legal maneuver might be, because they can't produce for the whole world anyway. And even if they can produce for the whole world and they want to monopolize all those profits, I will argue that, well, maybe 70 or 80% of the entire world's population will not be able to afford those high prices anyway. So production licenses with or without royalty, in some cases with royalty like that, what BioNTech is thinking of, in some cases no royalty like AstraZeneca licensing to Siam Biosciences, it doesn't cost Big Pharma anything to sort of license, to waive their patents. Thirdly, and finally, this can be making them as in the rich countries, consistent with the rules-based order that they created and they are benefiting from. So the element of hypocrisy, the element of, say, the moral authority that they frequently attribute to themselves, I think all these things are important reasons for the rich countries to share. Finally, my analysis is that IP justifications are used often as red herrings, things like innovation. It's not really innovation when you use 11 billion US dollars of US government funding and you want to socialize the risk but privatize the profit. So this is that's a red herring. Another red herring would be there's no investment in companies and the third world simply does not have the facilities to manufacture. I disagree, because companies and countries will invest if they receive a market signal that there will be waivers coming their way. So what's the point of committing 100 million US dollars or ringgit into expanding our production facilities in Malaysia for the Southeast Asia region when there's no signal from the market or from the global health political landscape that will do that? Finally, ladies and gentlemen, let me move to the next steps forward. I divide this into two components. In the right-hand side of the screen, in the box in green, I divide this into the short-term component and the long-term component. In the short term, I think we should explore all legal, technological, commercial solutions all at the same time. To only narrowly focus on winning a patent waiver may be too narrow a, shall we say, negotiation field for us. So things like production licenses, which was suggested by the CEO of BioNTech, that could be an example of something that could work. Now, is it ideal? Probably not. But short of an ideal, perfect, gold standard solution, I think we should grab everything on the table while mobilizing public responses and also citizen pressure. I'm a small part of this group called the People's Vaccine Alliance. There is an Asia, a bunch of CSOs in Asia that are part of the People's Vaccine Alliance Asia chapter. So if anybody's interested, please get in touch with me, and then I'll connect you and your NGO to the People's Vaccine Alliance as well. Citizen pressure and public responses will be very crucial in helping us achieve all the solutions that could be possible in this landscape. But in the long term, I'll end on this note, not only for today, but also for the next 10 years or so. In the long term, we need to change the political economy of global health. We need to balance the equity as well as the balance between equity and innovation and risk. Currently, it's skewed in favor of innovation and risk, but I think we need to balance that out more in favor of equity. So any band-aid solutions or temporary solutions that we institute for COVID-19 alone will not work in the long term because we're only solving the problem today. And COVID is just one pandemic. There could be a second pandemic and even worse, orders of magnitude worse than COVID and requiring greater global collaboration and solidarity. And we need to plan for the future. In parallel, providing a surrounding infrastructure of regulatory elements, legal elements, even liability elements. For example, if Big Pharma were to license out to a factory in, well, invent your country, maybe Rwanda for Africa or Thailand for Southeast Asia, who holds the liability for production, quality assurance, and compliance, and so on? And that surrounding infrastructure needs to be ready for the moment that patents are waived or we manage to fix the political economy of global health. Finally, Dr. Ida, you've asked me a question. Should we think about foregoing profit to save lives in this pandemic? Let me open the question up to the audience again. This is a big question. The question that we have to ask ourselves, and I've been struggling with, is actually, should we profit from healthcare? The easy answer to that is no. We shouldn't profit from healthcare, but we live in a world that we have to be realistic about this. So maybe the question then should be not so much can we profit, but should we profit? And if we should profit, what is a reasonable amount of profit? And I think different cultures, civilizations, countries, legal systems, and different ideologies will have different answers to this very interesting question. I have my personal view, I think hopefully we'll be sharing that as the conversation progresses. Prof. Ida, let me pause here. Over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Khor. That was a very clear illustration and answer in response to the question. I practically love your the point on what was that selfish reasons why pharmaceutical companies and developed countries should support the IP waiver. And I thought that basically sums up the whole discussion. And particularly so, you mentioned that we need to explore all legal, technological, and commercial solutions. And patent is just one of the solution which is needed in this COVID-19. Patent is not all. And with that, I then move to Sister Munirah Maarof. I still call you sister. As a young IP practitioner, what alternatives would you suggest resolving the access to vaccine and essential medicines problem without stepping too much on the toes of the pharmaceutical companies? Because we need these pharmaceutical companies to pull us out from this pandemic. What are the options out there that should be put on the table? I know Dr. Khor has mentioned quite a number of options, and maybe Munirah can come up with a few more other options. Thank you.
Prof. Okay, first and foremost, I'd like to say, thank you very much. I didn't intend to actually be on the panel, and I'm really deeply humbled because, like everyone else, I'm really esteemed panel speakers, and I've been learning a lot. So that's what I've been hoping the most, Prof. Ida. So, okay, thank you again. So just responding that before going into other alternatives that we might consider, responding to the issues on IP justifications like Dr. Khor and all the other speakers mentioned. 2 days ago as well, they've already covered this issue, or basically this point about what about compulsory licensing. You already have voluntary licensing. So they've actually discussed the weaknesses that they have when it concerns these options that we have in the current IP system, being it compulsory licensing or voluntary licensing. So there are it's all based on bilateral negotiations, and these creates bilateral relations, and there's going to be a long time. So given the situation that we have right now, we're facing a pandemic, and it's sort of everything is unexpected, and what's happening throughout any other industry, any other aspect of our lives, we've needed to pivot, right? So obviously, in this situation, when we're faced with patents being at the forefront of R&D, yet even development of any sort of new innovation of technology, we're looking at patents. And what does patent actually provide? It gives you exclusivity. So this is why patents come to the forefront. And I'm really glad that Dr. Khor actually pointed out all the different sort of alternatives that we could consider and should be sort of considered aside from patents. But now what we have here is that's holding us back is the exclusivity owned by these respective pharmaceutical companies. Of course, we've always had a discussion about how do you balance out this exclusivity, right, to avoid monopoly, right, avoid abuse of dominance, like Prof. Jomo pointed out, all the instances before that we faced on abuse of dominance of IP owners, right, especially when it comes to pharmaceutical companies. So this is what we have to actually look into solving, look into the future, how to overcome, because it's not something that has happened overnight. It's just become more urgent that we need to actually solve this issue now, because then it's a matter of like the world health. It's not just a certain country's public health. And it's more relevant when we're talking about equitable access. It's not just about a country that has privileged access, you know, like we're not talking about countries that are privileged, like the countries that are holding back are definitely privileged. You're looking at Switzerland, like countries like Norway, right? So we need to have a consideration that enables equitable access, just to uphold public health and public interest. So in the past, like we've heard of some IP owners like enabling, like we're not talking about voluntary licensing, even like free licensing. It's rare, I would say, but we've had this in the past, like when it comes to like Volvo. Remember when they came out with the 3-point seatbelt, and then they said like this is so important for the safety for any sort of automobile user, and they gave free licensing for every vehicle manufacturer to go on and use it, right? And now it's become like a law for you to actually have seatbelts in your car. But before this, it was just a patent that was owned by one of Volvo and its inventor who created the 3-point seatbelt. We've not seen so much of that happening. Yes, we have seen like co-licensing, right? So it's not all so bad. But when it comes to this point where it's so important that everyone has equitable access, it's sort of becoming like a cat fight, I would say. So this is really sad to see in this situation where everyone's sort of supposed to help each other, and especially in a very a much more advanced age, a more modernized time where everything's global, and we see that every country or every organization is in it for themselves. I mean, it's aside from the fact that Malaysians have this like hashtag saying kita jaga kita, right? But that doesn't mean to say that we're selfish, right? We're not supposed to be closed up in this sense, right? So I totally agree when it comes to like giving equitable access, and especially when it concerns public health and public interest of this at this level. Of course, and from where I come from, I'm looking at it also like it's a Western concept of R&D and also medicine and treatment, right? Maybe later on I'll go on to talk about like other ideas that I might have. But what I see here is like WIPO has, for example, like considerations when it comes to IP filing. So there are different like rates when it comes to fees, right? And if it comes to the extent when they're going to negotiations, where they could look at the price point, right? Of course, not every country has the same kind of power and influence and ability, right, to manufacture, or, you know, they've raised all these issues about raw materials, right, about capability to manufacture and produce, right? But again, like all the other speakers have mentioned, it's not about that. Once you have actually allowed the excess, then they'll come up with the investment. And again, you're looking at pharmaceutical R&D, it's a mix of private and public resources, right? So it's not just merely public funding. So how can you actually privatize the profits? Exactly like Dr. Khor said. So I am totally on the same page. Yeah, and what I've come up to be more curious about is the ethics behind R&D. So how do we overcome this problem in the future, right? Even if we do have, okay, yes, they say, yes, we support waiver. Yes, we do allow a waiver. But how do you actually enable the proper tech transfer, right? The knowledge transfer, the knowledge sharing on how to actually manufacture these vaccines. So like looking into the future, like how do we monitor ethics when it comes to research and development, especially in pharmaceuticals, right? And we're looking at, even apart from pharmaceuticals, in this current day and age, we have things like, what do you call it? Like cloning or deep facing, was it? Or there's this term, Prof, I know you.
Fake, is it?
Deep fake, yes, deep fake.
Ah.
So, you know, and then, I mean, what sort of ethics do we have when it comes to R&D? So that's our question, and especially when it comes to R&D, it's a lot of, all of it is private and confidential. So how does an external party ensure that these ethics are complied with? So I know I have more questions than I would have suggestions, Prof. So I think I'll stop there for now, and then I would look forward to actually hear more from everyone as well. Yes,
thank you very much, Munirah. You've basically illustrated the point that, you know, when it comes to intellectual property practice, it's not just about you commercializing your private property, and especially in this case where it encroaches into public space, and especially it involves people's lives. Right. I note that Sanya Reid there want to raise some questions. Yes, Sanya, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much for all the very useful points that have been made so far. And I just wanted to respond to a couple before asking Prof. Jomo a question. And the first one, of course, is that some people have been saying that the existing flexibilities in the WTO's intellectual property rules are enough to deal with the pandemic. But we've had since, February, March last year to use the existing TRIPS flexibilities like voluntary licenses, and yet we still don't have enough production of vaccines or N95 masks or test kits and so on, partly because of intellectual property protection. And so that's why on the webinar earlier this week, the former president of Switzerland, who was the chair of the World Health Organization's Commission on Intellectual Property Rights and the UN Secretary General's High-Level Panel on Access to Medicine, said that these existing TRIPS flexibilities are not enough, and that the proposed waiver, not just for vaccines, but for other things needed to prevent, treat, and contain COVID-19 needs to be agreed to. For example, it's not just vaccines, it's also, for example, the N95 masks. The governor of Kentucky said the patents on N95 masks need to be waived so that there can be enough masks. It's the trade secrets on the test kit reagents, and it's not clear to me what are the TRIPS flexibilities available for trade secrets. You know, can you use a compulsory license? And then even for compulsory licensing, if you were to apply it to, for example, to patents, you have the problem about exporting more than half of your production, and you have to use the paragraph 6 solution, which has only been used once by Canada, and the generic company who used it said they would never do it again because it was so difficult. And you have to do it country by country. So these supply chains, which involve parts, you know, to manufacture the vaccine across tens of different countries, each of those countries would have to issue compulsory licenses on the relevant parts for one vaccine. And so when the question comes, you know, well, what about voluntary licenses? You know, as I've said, we've seen that for the last year, it hasn't been enough. And for example, Canada tried to get local production of COVID vaccines. Every COVID vaccine manufacturer was asked to manufacture in Canada. They all refused. Pfizer has told Reuters they will not do any more voluntary licenses until the pandemic is over. So there have been news articles, which I can put in the chat, where vaccine manufacturers from Bangladesh to Denmark have said, we have spare capacity. We have asked these companies for voluntary licenses and they have not given them to us. So our spare vaccine manufacturing capacity is sitting idle. So then you come to the question about, well, if we have this waiver, will it affect companies' incentives to produce vaccines in future, including for variants? And we know, for example, that 97 to 99% of the research and development for the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine was publicly funded. I can put a link to the study in the chat. And we know that this waiver, as Prof. Jomo said, is only for a certain duration, not yet been agreed, it's yet to be negotiated. It's only for the COVID-19 technology, and it's only to certain parts of the TRIPS agreement. And not all countries will necessarily implement this waiver. So where they don't, they will still can apply for and enforce their patents.
Okay, Sanya, sorry to interrupt, but what's the question? You
yes, so
say-
the question is,
yes.
the question is to Prof. Jomo. One is, do you think that reducing intellectual property protection will reduce foreign direct investment? Is intellectual property protection a driver of foreign direct investment, including in Malaysia? Because, you know, the economists generally say foreign direct investment is driven by other things like market size, natural resources, peace and stability, infrastructure, and so on. And what about the economic consequences of not agreeing to this waiver? Because the OECD, quoting the International Chamber of Commerce, said that it could cost $9.2 trillion to the world economy if vaccines are not more widely accessible. And that was just for the vaccine part. And then lastly, of course, the counterfeit question. We all know that if you're worried about quality, safety, and efficacy of the vaccines, that's covered by medicine regulators like NPCs or NPRA in Malaysia, and that's separate to the question of whether there's intellectual property protection. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sanya, for the long interjection. But I think the most important thing is the questions that she raised to Prof. Jomo. Prof. Jomo, would you care to answer that first before we go to the second round?
Thank you very much, Prof. Ida, and thank you very much, Ms. Sanya Smith. I think it's very important for us to recognize that I'm stuck between lawyers. Okay? Hemingway is a lawyer, and Ms. Sanya Smith is a Rhodes Scholar lawyer from Oxford, and so on and so forth. They're both from the same part of the world, and you know, so I'm not going to talk about some of the legal implications, but thankfully, Ms. Sanya Smith raises the question of its economic implications. There is no evidence. There is no evidence that lack of IP protections actually will limit FDI. In fact, the FDI developments in the recent period have actually been very poor in Malaysia for a whole range of reasons, and it's certainly not because Malaysia has been ambiguous because of FDI. Globally as well, again, I have to emphasize that there is no evidence whatsoever that there is a reduction of FDI due to IP enforcement. The only exception I'll have to emphasize is Singapore. And in the case of Singapore, around sometime in the 1990s, Singapore decided to go the other way. For many, many years, before the mid-1990s, Singapore was actually the place you went to get everything which was, you basically lower the cost of living by going to shop in Singapore. But the authorities in Singapore decided to enforce intellectual property rights very, very strongly in order to attract a new range of investments. And it has been successful, undoubtedly. But Singapore is an exception because the same things did not happen in countries like the Republic of Korea or even the Taiwan province of China, and where we saw a great deal of technological progress. And arguably, Singapore's own technological progress has been limited by the strengthening of intellectual property rights. So I think while making the general statement, I think I have to qualify it because of the Singapore exception. And arguably, there has been, at the other place where one would make this exception would be the case of Israel. But the case of Israel seems to suggest a much more complicated situation where there was a great deal of what would now be called counterfeiting taking place in the early developments of technology, particularly in Technion, in Haifa, and so on and so forth. Now, the other issue, of course, is the damage which is going to be caused. There are any number of estimates what one can estimate, and I would not look to the WHO for an economic estimate, but all the estimates are resoundingly clear about the likely economic implications of a slow resolution of the pandemic. And there is no doubt whatsoever, looking at it from a epidemiological point of view, that the inability to deal not only with the vaccine issue, but also with the other issue, the ability to test, for example. I think it's very important here to distinguish the experience of East Asia, where East Asia has been able to contain the crisis by and large without resorting to whole-scale stay-in-shelter lockdowns. And this is true. It's also true of Australia and New Zealand and a number of other countries. So avoiding stay-in-shelter lockdowns by effective measures to prevent and contain contagion urgently has been crucial. And this is why lowering the cost of tests takes place. Even for a country which claims to be on the cusp of becoming a high-income country, such as Malaysia, we see that not enough tests are taking place. And it's because of the high cost of tests. So that's why the range of items for which it is going to be, for which a waiver is being requested, it does not involve just vaccines. And I think in this regard, I think it's very important if Dr. Hemingway is convinced that the countries, that the companies concerned are interested in finding very clear solutions. There could have been counter proposals put before the World Trade Organization. No such proposals have not been forthcoming in the last half year, and they are unlikely to be forthcoming. What we are going to see now is a great deal of foot dragging, because unfortunately the World Trade Organization works on the basis of consensus. I think it's important to emphasize that in 2005, many people will remember that the only country to manufacture 300 million doses of Tamiflu to deal with the avian flu crisis at that time was the United States. No other country was able to do so, and it was only because President Bush at that time insisted on going ahead, even though the United States was not under direct threat, because birds are not able to fly across major oceans such as the Atlantic and the Pacific to get to North America. So that there was no direct Tamiflu threat, but the only country which was sufficiently well protected was the United States. The rest of the world tried, much of the rest of the world tried. Asia, many countries in Asia tried, and the country which went furthest at that time was Taiwan province of China, and it was not able to do so because of the Tamiflu manufacturers from Switzerland. So I think it is important to recognize that compulsory licensing is not something which countries resort to because they want to, because it's the easy default. They resort to this precisely because they have very little choice. And and the excuses which we have found basically, throughout the world, I'm not particularly referring to what has been said today, are unfortunately largely bogus and basically intended to delay progress on this issue.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jomo. That's a very lengthy response to the question. It's funny how, compulsory licensing, although it's allowed in almost all IP statutes, but, looked upon very, very frowningly by the developed countries and the pharmaceutical companies, which leads us to round two. And I will shoot questions to the fourth panelist, and I would be happy if you can respond it within 5 minutes, and so that we can take more questions from the audience. Prof. Jomo, you wrote a column on this in many columns, entitled Intellectual Property Monopolies Block Vaccine Access, The Year of Living Dangerously, Caught in a Tangled Web of Vaccine Nationalism, Intellectual Property Cause of Death, Genocide. Your use of genocide in that column somehow offends some people in the industry. What do you mean when you use the word genocide there, Prof. Jomo? If you care to clarify the reason why you use the word genocide in that column.
Yes, thank you very much. I know that Dr. Hemingway has taken great offense to this and raised the issue of genocide. As Dr. Hemingway, as an expert in law, should also know, the meaning of the term genocide has been quite ambiguous. In law, it might have particular meanings, but the actual use of the term genocide has been quite ambiguous. If one looks up a dictionary and to look at what the word genocide means, it refers to a particular mass killing of a particular ethnic group or nation. I want to emphasize all nation, okay? So originally, of course, much of the early discussion of genocide after the Second World War referred to the Jews who died in Central Europe because of the Nazi policy. Subsequently, it was recognized that other ethnic groups, such as the Roma and so on, were also singled out for persecution. If we look particularly at the case of Russia, where over 20 million people died, it is often by a narrow interpretation of the use of genocide, 20 million people dying in Russia, over 20 million people dying in Russia is not considered genocide for some, but certainly many people will say the same. The number of people who were killed by the Japanese invasion of China is similarly high, but some people would say it was not genocide because it wasn't the Chinese people who were singled out for. So the use of the term genocide has been ambiguous in international law, as international lawyers such as yourselves all know, and I don't want to quibble on the legal definition. If Dr. Hemingway is not comfortable with the use of genocide, I would ask him to suggest an alternative alternative term to describe the likely death of about 2.5 million people in the world, largely from poor countries, who are going to die as a consequence of delay in the vaccination process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jomo. So he's basically using it in the context of the number of lives that has perished in this fight against pandemic-19 and the urgency of the situation, right? The reason why we need this TRIPS IP waiver, which leads me to a question to Dr. Chris Hemingway. You've mentioned that the proposal brings about very many technical problems, right? You've also mentioned that there is already a mechanism within the IP system itself to deal with the problem that we're having now. You've used word like, if we support this TRIPS waiver, it's like using a sledgehammer to crack a nut. And you've also mentioned that, you know, without parent, what other incentive is there for the parent company, for the pharmaceutical company to come up with new drugs? And particularly so, there's going to be further mutations of the virus, and the pharmaceutical company will definitely be creating or developing more and more medicines in response to that. And you've also mentioned that if we allow the sharing of trade secrets, that is akin to corporate espionage, and that will lead to a lot of chilling effect on R&D nowadays. Now, with all those reservations, what would be the way for the pharmaceutical company to assist in these initiatives to reduce gap to access to essential medicine, not only vaccines, as mentioned by other panelists, also PPE, tests, diagnostic kits, and the like. I know the pharmaceutical companies are also eager to help out, but what is their solution to the way forward in this pandemic?
Thanks, Prof. So I think what's clear is that I think Dr. Khor mentioned earlier that IP has hampered progress, but I think we also need to remember that if we didn't have the development from the pharmaceuticals, we managed to get a vaccine into the world within about 9 months, and that's pretty quick. And I don't think that would have existed if you didn't have the product development, which was assisted with the intellectual property behind it, and building on the previous innovations. There is some discussion that, or maybe it was just the money that did that, but my feeling is that and in fact the Serum Institute of India confirms this, is that the money is more about scaling up production facilities than the IP. IP isn't an issue so much on that part, and I do believe that it's something that actually assists getting vaccines initially into the world. And of course, it's an ongoing process. There's more and more developments coming out as we go through. And that brings up another issue with the with the waiver is, well, what actually do we mean by something that's related to COVID? If we're talking about patents relating to COVID or equipment relating to COVID, where do you draw the line and who decides? When you look at the WTO waiver request, they say, well, it's up to the countries to decide. Well, does that mean the government then? So it's a bit unusual and a bit confusing, because when you look at the waiver request, they talk about patents from a few years ago, not the current batch, which actually haven't really been published yet. We don't really know what's in the current batch because patents aren't published for 18 months. But you'll see there's patents from a few years ago which weren't actually developed for COVID. They were developed for something else. So are those relevant? Are they covered by the waiver? Let's look at Malaysia. Top Glove makes a lot of gloves. Would that be covered by the waiver? I don't know what the answer is to this, but you know, if suddenly you allow companies to use countries to allow the IP of others to do this, I can foresee that there might actually end up being a lot of litigation. I might be quite busy helping these people. So, but you know, you actually could end up in a worse situation than a better one because of the results coming from it. Now, going back to the waiver request itself and TRIPS, I think one of the big issues is this compulsory licensing, and especially if you're trying to export it. I think Sonia Smith said there's quite onerous requirements. You have to have special packaging. You have to tell. You have to publish everything that you're doing. You have to tell the governments that are related. So I think there's a feeling that it can be quite difficult, particularly if a country hasn't been done before. Plus, there's pressure from other governments. So when Malaysia did the compulsory license on what was it, hepatitis, I think, a few years ago, there was pressure from the US government not to allow it. Well, you know, there's an argument to say, well, if you do that, if you get a WTO waiver, there's still going to be pressure on the governments not to do whatever it is they're going to do. So in some ways, it doesn't help. What might be more palatable, and Prof. Jomo said, you know, no one's made use of the compulsory licensing yet. Yeah, that's probably an issue, but and no one's put forward an alternative to that. But neither has there been an alternative from the supporters to saying, well, why don't we go for something a bit simpler, something that might be a bit more palatable? I suspect one of the concerns is that because it's quite wide-ranging, it's not very clear how this would work in practice. You know, we're not just taking small chunks of TRIPS out. There's quite large sections. And if we can focus on certain bits, maybe that would be easier to get through and get consensus on with the WTO. And one of my suggestions would be to waive the part that talks about the difficulties in making in producing exportable products, you know, the packaging and so on. If there are already exceptions to compulsory licensing in health emergencies, and that could be utilized where there are laws in the countries that have it, or you could rely on the emergency provisions on countries that don't have it, which is what the WTO waiver intends to do anyway. And you could restrict or maybe waive the part that restricts it to domestic licensing only. The actual part is 31F of TRIPS. If you take that part out, well, now you can produce not just domestically, but also for abroad, and you have less restrictions. Now, Prof. Jomo did also ask me, how are we doing for time? Did I have an alternative word for genocide? Well, I don't. My maybe catastrophe would be my answer. But in all seriousness, I think that my issue with genocide is the word genocide is that the word is normally associated with deliberate targeting of a nation or people, and it's not the case here. It's not deliberate. Okay, there's different interpretations, but that was the exception I took to the original comment. Yes, it's probably a moral catastrophe in many ways. I wish we are now starting to see, fortunately, some countries starting to share. So I think President Biden has recently sent 50 million doses of one of the vaccines to India, I think, because of what's happening there at the moment. So there is some movement starting to happen, at least, and hopefully that will continue as we go on. Okay, I think I've used up my time, so I'll pass it back to you now, Prof. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Chris. One of the points that you raised is that you want whatever solution that we come up with must be palatable to the pharmaceutical companies. But I think the most important thing is that it's not only palatable, but it has to be practicable as well. And it should be able to resolve the issue for this speedy access to vaccines and essential medicines, which leads to the question to Dr. Swee, Kheng, Khor, right? We've heard that the US government has agreed to the IP waiver in regards to vaccine. But if you look at the whole ecosystem in relation to health industry, the parent covers a lot more than just vaccines and essential medicines. And of recent, you can see the number of filings filed by pharmaceutical companies on recent fixes, such as Regeneron and antiviral medicine by Merck, and Roche as well has filed patents over monoclonal antibody therapy. So with this increasing number of patents over items which we need in this fight against COVID-19, what is your view as a public health advocate and practitioner? Now that we're fighting against COVID-19, do you think that we should be a bit more strict with regard to patents, especially those that are useful for COVID-19 vaccines and essential medicines? Do you advocate for free licenses for not only vaccines, but also for all products that are useful for the fight against COVID-19? Yes, Dr. Khor.
Prof. Ida, thank you. Your question is somewhat binary, so I will answer in short terms and say yes. I think patents should be expanded. The word expanded is deliberately broad. We can waive, we can share, we can invent your word and invent your legal maneuver. But the idea is to expand patents in such a way that we can guarantee better, larger, more access to all this life-saving technology to as many people, or rather everyone in this whole world, not as many people, but to everyone in this whole world. So I'm of that principle that the outcomes are much more important to me. So is there within the realm of possibility that we have an outcome that we can get this technologies out to everyone without having the patent conversation? Because the patent conversation could be a political hot potato. People have staked out very, say, entrenched positions there. And I think it's a very emotive issue. But could there be other ways for us to achieve the outcomes, right? And patents is one part of the solution. So that's me staking out my position and answering your question, Prof. Ida. But secondly, let me take the conversation a little deeper. The medicines that you've identified earlier, Regeneron and so on and so forth, they are perhaps not relevant only to the COVID situation, because generally speaking, the treatment guidelines, meaning if you have COVID, what can we do to cure you? The treatment guidelines aren't very clear. So there's some convalescent plasma, which doesn't have a patent to it, dexamethasone or high-dose steroids, which doesn't have a patent to it as well. So there are many treatment options available. I mean, firstly, there are very few treatment options available, and whatever that's available for COVID might not actually be under the realm of patent. So the patent conversation for COVID treatments, not vaccines, yeah, because your question was and examples were about treatments, may not be, say, a useful conversation, but it's useful as a part of a broader conversation about all the medicines that's available in this world. And here I bring up the example of this concept called a patent cloud. A patent cloud is a bit of a strategy by the IP lawyers inside pharma, where they, file a patent for the size of the needle, for example. So the needle, instead of 23 gauge, is now a 25 gauge. The formulation is exactly the same. The drug, the molecule, everything's exactly the same. Just the size of the needle is different. I'm being a little, say, dramatic in my example, but this is just to illustrate the fact that patents could be filed on a product that has got nothing to do with the innovation value of the product, and is actually, unfortunately, a recognized pharma strategy. So if you Google patent cloud and the actions that were taken by regulators against patent clouds, this would be helpful for us to understand as well. Prof. Ida, allow me to answer your question in a third and final way by engaging Dr. Hemingway in some of his comments. He commented that one of the reasons why the vaccines were developed so quickly is because of the patents that are available. I agree that is true, but I think there are multiple other more significant and larger, more important reasons why the vaccine development was so fast, and that's because which countries were affected. And when rich countries were affected, not poor countries, then they had an incentive to put in so much money, political will, regulatory approvals, Operation Warp Speed, and so on and so forth in order to protect themselves. It's a fact of life that the world is organized as a collection of nation states at the moment without really a world government. I don't fault the rich country governments for doing so. They're only acting in their own self-interest and the self-interest of their voters and citizens and taxpayers. But having said all that, right, the speed of development meant that, the speed of the development was so fast because the rich countries were involved, leading to the possibility of a scenario, and I'll end my comments here, the scenario that COVID becomes a neglected tropical disease, that COVID becomes endemic only in the tropical countries or poor countries, when rich countries have already vaccinated themselves, they always have new vaccine variants and so on and so forth. Eventually, COVID becomes something that like schistosomiasis or trachoma or river blindness, things that I've never seen before in my life because they're mostly in say, poor countries. And if COVID becomes a neglected tropical disease, it would have been because of the terrible decisions that we've made today. Thanks, Prof. Ida, over to you.
Thank you very much. Last point was very, very interesting point, which leads to Siti Munirah. How do you foresee the proposal to be revised? I mean, the pharmaceutical company is talking again and again about wanting to make the proposal clearer, right? Make it more specific, make it more time limited, make it more purposeful. Now, as a young IP practitioner, and you've studied IP in full endeavor, and you've also practicing IP, what is your wish list with the IP system? We all know that the problem is not just IP, it is more than IP, but IP is one of the problem. We are told that this pandemic is here for the long haul. So how do you see this whole discussion on COVID-19 going to shape the future of IP system in the future?
Thanks, Prof. Okay, the first question is, how do you see the proposal might be further narrowed down? I think it depends on how the negotiations go, but at the forefront, I would guess that the main thing that they would need to consider is depending on the economic as well as manufacturing capabilities or excesses, other types of excesses that each country might be capable of. So I think how it goes into the scope of the waiver would be further narrowed down according to regions perhaps, or even different countries, because not everyone has the same capability. So the main content of the waiver is actually to allow equitable access, especially for those poorer nations, right? So that's how I would see that it might be made more specific, and it all goes back down to the negotiations on how to appease the pharmaceutical companies to actually really allow proper tech transfer. And yes, it's not just about patents, but IP as a whole. Ms. Tanya actually also raised the issue about compulsory licensing when it comes to trade secrets, right? So, this is it's very difficult to actually respond to this. One is trade secrets, right? There are countries definitely they have the registrations for trade secrets, like Malaysia. We don't have that yet. So it's a bit difficult on how do you actually tackle this issue, and how do you ensure proper transfer of tech or knowledge, right, or sharing of the background of the related IPs. That's why when I mentioned about ethics, right, I think in the future it goes back, how do we actually monitor or sort of have ethics for R&D? Because at the end of the day, it's not just about the registration or recognition of specific kinds of innovations, like Prof. Ida, you raised just now, should we actually consider what kind of registrations when it comes to this pandemic, right, should be considered so that it would not be monopolized or abused. Well, that's one way of looking at it, yes, but also we don't want to stifle innovation. So how do we balance it out? But I think one of the I forgot his, there's one former Nobel laureate. He also mentioned that we need to actually really highly consider ethics when it comes to R&D. So especially in the pharmaceutical industry and also other types of innovations. But how do we go about that? So like a lot of companies say, yes, we do have ethics, but how do you monitor, and to what extent do they actually like comply again? Okay, going on. When it comes to this pandemic, we're talking about the vaccines. We're talking about Western concept of medicine, and I've always had this idea, like, why do we are so highly dependent on the Western concept of medicine and treatment, right? And the cost of medicine, even insurance, goes up every year, right? And we're so highly dependent, and even though there is these accesses, even though we're not talking about vaccines, it's not the only way to actually overcome a particular illness or a disease or any sort of challenge when it comes to health. So one thing that I would definitely want to actually see happening is more, the rise of traditional concept of medicine, traditional medicine, and as well as complementary medicine. So there is not so much of concentration on one particular concept of medicine and treatment that we have like nowadays, and that's why we have all these drugs that are highly monopolized by these pharmaceutical companies. So it's like when we're looking at the financial sector, there's a decentralization, right? So I think the future is like going through that decentralization and looking at what are the other alternatives. That we do have alternatives, but how do we actually make them on par, right? Because it's just the fact that there's not much funding going on into like traditional medicine, building that aspect, but there's so much concentration done in the Western concept of medicine and treatment. So that's basically like where I come from. And when it comes to IP system, how do I see that the IP system, what do they need to consider to actually be able to be more balanced, to help not only the IP owners, but also all these different interests that needs to be protected? They need to just be flexible, right? So of course you do have a foundation, but when it comes to situations like this, we need to consider to like pivoting. Every other industry has considered doing something extraordinary, right? We're talking about a situation that is extraordinary. So we need to actually be flexible in this and not just like uphold a particular system just because that it is there, but seeing how it can be practical so that it could be assessed like equitably for everyone, and depending again on the type of innovation. But when we're talking about something that affects public health, public interest, then they need to give more consideration to that on how we can actually make it more flexible to actually allow access to this, even though there are IP rights that need to be held. So we're not talking about like free licensing. Even though I did mention about the situation with Volvo earlier, I'm not saying that everyone needs to give free licensing, of course not, right? But there needs to be a fair way on how do we balance out. We do recognize that these IP owners have, we need to actually give equal contribution and consideration back to them because of their contribution via their innovation. But how do we actually balance this out in such a way that everyone does have equitable access according to their respective capabilities, not only as organizations, but also like countries as a whole, like when we're talking about this pandemic right now. Yes, thank you, Prof. I hope.
Thank you very much, Munirah.
It's a bit of like something very different, I know, but I really think that there needs to be an alternative to Western medicine. There's just too much of a reliance here.
Yeah, but you realize that many people actually resorted to alternative medicines. And you realize that there are many people who are anti-vaccine, they're scared of vaccine in modern medicine, right? All right, maybe we can respond to some of the questions which were raised by the audience. I just have to tell the panelists that we have 60 of my students in this panel, in this forum as well, because I made it compulsory for them to attend the questions, to attend the forum. So their questions may sound a bit basic, but I think it would be nice if the panelists can respond to these questions. They are our budding lawyers in the future anyway, right? All right, now this is a question from Umay Marshita. Some critics have mentioned that the decision of countries to support the waiver will weaken already strained supply chains, create confusion between public and private partners, and foster the proliferation of counterfeit vaccines. What are your views on this? And maybe I can open it up to all the 4 panelists to respond to this. Basically pointing out the downside of supporting this waiver. The problem with supply chains, the problem of creating confusion between public and private partners, the fact that there might be an increase in counterfeit vaccines. Maybe Dr. Khor want to respond, or Prof. Jomo, or Dr. Chris?
Well, I think I'll go if nobody else will. What Ms. Mashita is referring to are possibilities, just like Dr. Hemingway earlier referred to all kinds of possibilities. But we also know that there are regulatory practices which take place all over the world, which it's not a developed country difference here, which can be used to check it. Let me be very clear that there is no guarantee that just by resolving this IP issue, all problems will be solved. I think Dr. Hemingway is quite correct in reminding us that IP is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. But it is wrong for Bill Gates or for others to suggest that IP is irrelevant. That's, I think we have to disagree. Now, I think it's also very important for us to recognize that there are problems. But if we look at the case of AstraZeneca and the Serum Institute, which are cited by Dr. Hemingway, it's a very interesting example because the Serum AstraZeneca shared the technical knowledge from Oxford with the Serum Institute, which has a huge capacity to produce, but they only was shared with a very, very limited orders for certain parts of the world, and that is what has happened. But it doesn't mean that it cannot be done with any other company, And the fact that Serum Institute did not have an IP problem because there was a willingness of Oxford University through AstraZeneca to share that knowledge, that problem is easily resolved. Now, I want to also emphasize that in the case of Moderna, that there is a similar promise. Moderna, the leadership of Moderna, who are largely from University of Pennsylvania, former University of Pennsylvania and MIT researchers, they have made very clear that they do not want to profit from the pandemic. So this is important. Now, there is enabling legislation in the case of the US. I'm less clear about Europe because Moderna's was publicly funded by President Trump's Operation Warp Speed. It is the US government can require Moderna to do certain things, including share the necessary knowledge. I think we agree that patenting, patents and sharing of patents is only part of the issue. That I think we have to agree on. I think the other question which was raised in this connection is the whole question of the delay. 18 months delay makes a world of difference. A world of difference in this kind of situation. The whole reason why all these vaccines have been approved after phase 2 trials on a conditional basis is precisely because they are experimental. Now, we also know that, and Dr. Hemingway and other lawyers know that there is this problem of evergreening. You can basically keep on extending a patent by suggesting something which is happening all the time. And we know that even in the last half a year, since the first vaccines became available, and I want to emphasize that the first vaccine which became available was the Sputnik vaccine in Russia, we have seen improvements by all the companies involved. Okay, and this is most welcome. It is to be encouraged. And what we are calling for is cooperation, not exclusive competition or exclusion. The problem with patents is that it confers monopoly rights, and those monopoly rights have been consistently abused by IP holders. And that is the issue, and that is the reason for the debate. But I think we are agreed that IP alone is not the issue, and there are trade secrets, and there is other technical knowledge which is not contained in the IP information, which is important. And this is why I emphasize that there are very few no companies, no significant big pharma companies. There are some small companies, but no significant big pharma companies have signed on to C-Act. And we also know that Act A, which is the other initiative, has got about 15% of the needed financing, and it's not going to go very far at the rate things are going. I think it's also important for us to recognize that corporations have had no problems internationalizing the supply chain. A very crucial feature of internationalization, globalization in the recent period has been the internationalization of supply chains. So why is there sudden concern about this? In the past, there were technology transfer agreements and so on and so forth, which were voluntarily negotiated by companies. But ever since 1995, with TRIPS, we have seen a greater reluctance to share knowledge. And this has retarded, I would argue, whereas what we should be doing in the world today is to share knowledge. And it is precisely that sharing of knowledge which becomes extremely important. I want to emphasize also that when that compulsory licensing was done by the United States government in 2005, the second Bush administration, Bush the second administration, okay, that was done not without compensating Tamiflu. That's why we haven't heard Tamiflu complaining vigorously. It wasn't what they wanted. It wasn't what they wanted, but it was precisely that which was very important. So I think what we are talking about is, I have very strong views about intellectual property, but that's a debate for another day. What we are talking about today is what is needed to deal with the situation now. And as every moment, every day means more unnecessary, more avoidable deaths. And the main thing standing in the way right now is the willingness of the crucial, of the companies concerned to share the knowledge as is needed in order to scale up production and scale up dissemination. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Jomo. In fact, he touches on two things. One is evergreening. I was wondering whether this evergreening is the same like patent cloud, which was mentioned by Dr. Khor just now. I'm sure some of you will be wondering. The other thing, that important point that Prof. Jomo has pointed out, is that compulsory licensing is actually good for business. And in fact, it is something that pharmaceutical companies would, accept, because they're still getting money from the technology that is compulsory licensed to others. Although, compulsory license itself draws a lot of negative stigma, and countries that issues compulsory license are under heavy pressure from developed countries as well as pharmaceutical companies. Right. What about the other panelists? Do you want to respond to that question? Dr. Chris, do you want to respond? Yes.
Perhaps I can jump in then.
Yes.
Just working backwards a little bit. So you mentioned the difference between US clouds and evergreening. So
yeah.
This, I would say this is actually more of a problem in the US than it is in other countries, in my experience anyway. So I think with clouds, what Dr. Khor is talking about is what I would normally refer to as a thicket. It's when you get lots of patents all relating to things which are very similar. So whereas, so for example, I think he gave the example of a needle, a 23 gauge compared to a 25 gauge, and all sorts of different things. That happens a lot in the US. Actually, it doesn't seem to happen so much in other countries, and I think that's partly because of the way the US law works. It's just one of those things. Evergreening, on the other hand, is when this happens a lot in pharmaceuticals, where let's say you have a drug, you develop a drug, you have a patent that lasts for 20 years, and just before the end of the 20 years, you file another patent for a new way of making the drug. So you get another 20 years. And then after that, you get, you find, okay, now I've discovered that different doses of that drug work better. So I'm going to try and get another 20 years. So you can, that's what I mean by we normally refer to as evergreening, where instead of this initial 20 years, it gets longer and longer, and you protect your monopoly for longer. Again, and this isn't something that's restricted to the US, actually. This does happen in other countries too. But with every patent, and this is also something I should say that really only affects patents, it's less for the other types of intellectual property rights. But the other thing to bear in mind is that it depends on often depends on the stringency of the intellectual property law in the country of question. So Europe, for example, is quite strict about things like that. They don't like giving patents for things like doses. You can get them, but more often than not, they are invalidated when challenged. And I think it's getting harder to develop that sort of thing. But I agree, it is a problem, and it is a particular issue that would affect that's relating to pharmaceuticals in this sort of market. Now, just going back to the original question about the problem with potential counterfeit vaccines. Well, yeah, it might be an issue. I think this is one of the things we touched on earlier, where while there are regulatory authorities that are supposed to look after these things, the fact remains that they detect quite a lot of problems. I think it was something like 15% of reviews in the US give rise to issues, not necessarily counterfeits, but the drug has been tainted, or there's some other problem. There's actually an issue with AstraZeneca, I think, for a batch of AstraZeneca vaccine in the US at the moment that's been tainted with something that shouldn't have been. So this affects innovators, the original pharmaceuticals as well. But the issue for me is that, well, okay, it's twice as bad in other countries. It's twice as bad for the the examples I've seen were in China and India. And you're always going to get some which slip through the net. So while you hope that is minimized, you're always going to get something coming through. And that's the concern, I suppose, is that regardless of whether there are regulators, they can't do everything. As much as you would like them to, it's normally done by batch. So there's always going to be a few things that get through the market. Now, I'm glad one of the things that Prof. Jomo said was that sharing knowledge was important, because I agree. And I would also say that that's one of the things that patents encourage. It's compulsory for a patent to tell the person reading it how the invention works. And that's how you build up on it. The issue in this particular case with a patent system is that you have to wait 18 months, which, as he rightly says, is a long time if you're trying to rely on that information. The patent may then get granted, which of course is even more of an issue if it's preventing you from doing what you want, if you're on that side. But of course you can accelerate these things as well. And I think some of the initial work has been brought forward, so it's published earlier. And with licensing agreements, they are normally part of the condition is that the knowledge is shared. Part of the other issue, I think, is that it's not just about patents, it's also the know-how, the trade sequence, if you want, if you like. And so how do you persuade the pharmaceuticals to share the knowledge that they only might have internally? And I don't know if there's an easy answer to that other than some kind of licensing agreement. I think Dr. Khor was saying earlier, it would be good if there was some knowledge sharing platform or free licensing or some sort of agreement like that where it was a bit easier to get hold of this information. But I don't know what the answer is to that. Okay, all right, I'll pass back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr.
Prof. Ida,
yes.
Responding to the counterfeit, I think Ms. Sanya actually posted in the chat room that there are already platforms where they can actually overcome to, prove the authenticity. There's NPRAs, yeah, so that's just to point that out.
Yeah. So there are already initiatives in the pipeline or already ongoing as to, checking whether the vaccines is valid, legitimate or counterfeit. So you don't have to worry that it will lead to the production of counterfeit vaccines. My technician is telling me that our time is almost up. Maybe I will allocate the remaining 10 minutes to Sister Munirah and Dr. Khor to give final words, on the topic. Munirah, what will be your final words?
Thank you, Prof. Okay, just to respond, well, Dr. Chris shared about how patent also encourages like sharing of innovation or information on the innovation. So yes, I agree on that. So that that's the, like, when it comes to registrations, yes, we do have, like, you need to actually share what is the innovation about. Let's say when it comes to patents, right? So what is it about? What is the scope that you're protecting as well? So to a certain extent, yes, there is sort of a requirement that you need to actually share what makes up your innovation. If it's a pharmaceutical product, what makes up of the drug? So there is there is disclosure or revelation of information when it comes to that through the patent registrations or patent filings. That is true, but it's just that when it comes to here, when we're talking about the COVID and access to rights to the patents, that's the concern here. And rightly, like as pointed out by Dr. Chris, he mentioned about the know-how, right? The tech transfer. Like, how do you confirm that would happen following a waiver, even, right? So that I mean, that is the question that we have, but it's just at the moment here, we're just trying to actually push through getting like access, so that everyone has equitable access. Not everyone pays the same, but it goes by, like, the economic distribution according to the purchasing power of the country. So again, of course, they're like we really like salute the companies, the organizations who go out to say that we are not profiting of the pandemic, like Prof. Jomo mentioned about Moderna, right? We're not trying to actually ignore or their rights even, right? It's just like making sure that everyone has equitable access. So that, of course, it goes back to the negotiations. I'm sure like Ms. Sanya would be able to know, and even Prof. Jomo would know to what extent the negotiations go about, and that would come out with the respective agreements and respective treaties. It would cover definitely the licensing arrangements of the tech transfer of the know-hows, even all the different types of intellectual properties covered, be it patents or trade secrets. The concern also, just like when we're talking about trade secrets, again, like it's similar, like if it is registrable in a certain country, it might be easy for you to actually address compulsory licensing. But if there is no proper system of registration or recognition of trade secret, and it is truly a trade secret and it is truly confidential information, and it's much more difficult for you to actually put your hands on anywhere when it comes to like compulsory licensing, right, Prof? So that's why it's a bit difficult to actually respond to that, unless when we're talking about trade secrets, which there is a proper system of registration, then it might be more, it's not easier even with that, but there is substance for you to actually move on when you're talking about compulsory licensing, because you can actually point to a particular registration or a particular scope of IP or innovation that you wish to actually seek compulsory licensing. Since the topic here today is about the vaccinations and the relevant treatments and accompanying products, again, like in the future, it's about, for me, it's about the ethics of R&D. I'm all for innovation, but what kind of innovation? To what extent do we allow innovation and commercialization? How do we actually monitor the commercialization of these IP products, especially by respective IP owners? We applaud them for coming out with this, and also everyone has their different kinds of expertise, but then it goes back to how does it affect different interests, right? If it's just pure commercialization, we're talking about Microsoft, maybe it's a bit different, right? And we even like Facebook, all these different tech that has actually changed the world we live in today. they are recognized, yeah, but it has to be reasonable, right? It can't abuse the dominant position that you hold in. So it goes hand in hand. So someone also mentioned about cooperation between WIPO and WHO. I'm sure there is already, even like traditional medicine and complementary medicine, there is like discussions between WIPO as well as WHO. And without a doubt, I'm sure at this level, they are already, they're working and discussing closely together when it comes to all these types of negotiations.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, all right.
I want to give the last 4 minutes to Dr.
Thank you,
Khor,
Prof.
particularly in relation to one of the points that were raised earlier, whether this IP waiver, if we proceed with it, will it disincentivize the pharmaceutical company from developing further medicines in case this virus mutates. And he mentioned that the reason why these vaccines are developed very fast is because rich countries are affected. So self-interest is here, right? When self-interest drives something, the outcome will come very, very fast. So Dr. Khor, what is your last words with regards to the topic that we are discussing today?
Prof. Ida, thank you. You've given me the really tough question. I think this is really the crux of the entire matter. What are the incentives built in the global health innovation research landscape that will ensure that there will be future vaccines, not only this one, but future vaccines for COVID, other diseases, and so on and so forth. So I'll make some comments and share thoughts in 2 levels. One is competition, the other one is incentives. But before that, I would like to remind everyone what my position is, which is patents, the use of patents needs to be shared, waived, expanded, whatever legal maneuver is necessary so that we can achieve the outcome. And the outcome is equitable access to the product. I'm less focused on the patents themselves than the actual outcome, which is get those vaccines to everyone around the world as quickly as possible. And we need multiple solutions, and patent is one part of the jigsaw puzzle of solutions to get that outcome. And pardon my hyper focus on the outcomes. Let me set that aside, right? The hyper focus on outcomes, right? And patents as a tool, as a means to that end of outcomes by focusing on patents themselves right now. And let's examine this from 2 angles. I'm not an economist, neither am I a behavioral psychologist or a business specialist, but here I am, I'm going to plow ahead and talk about competition and incentives. What we want in the whole global health landscape is enough healthy, constructive competition and collaboration at the same time. So you should share genetic material and so on and so forth by using something called the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, or the PIP framework under the World Health Organization. That's got sharing of genetic material for the viruses so that you can do the research that's necessary to create the vaccine. The point I'm making is there should be some collaboration in the system, and solidarity, collaboration, cooperation, all these things are beautiful, but competition is important, because only when there is competition will you allow people to, well, have the best vaccines, the speediest vaccines, the best access, the best solutions, most innovation, and so on. So I am a fan of competition. So how can we incentivize competition to take place in constructive ways in order to achieve, say, new innovations? And that's really the crux of it. The entire pharma lobby's premise, right, for rejecting patent waivers outright is because they say it disincentivizes innovation. I don't believe this is true, and I think their claims are a bit misleading. Let me set all that aside and talk about incentives in a few ways. When we look at incentives, it's not always financial. So we live in this capitalistic society where we think that the only motivating factor for every human being or every organization is money. That is not the case, not always the case. And frequently scientific achievement, intellectual prestige, the fact that you want to do public service, even the pleasure of doing the work itself, I think will be very powerful motivating factors, if not more powerful than money, or say going to an IPO or having $1 billion in the bank, in your bank account. The point I'm making is the range of possible motivating factors for science and researchers are a little different from that of the commercial owners of a particular company. So if you separate the two, that there are incentives for the owners of companies and the incentives of the scientists in those pharma companies that are doing the research, then maybe you have a bit of a clearer direction forward. As I've mentioned in my closing remarks in my first session, I propose the revisiting of the political economy of global health, and built into that is the revisiting of incentive structures that maybe we need to provide a new financial and non-financial incentives on top of the whole, say, patent architecture for around the world, right? So that we can have a more sustainable solution moving forward. I guess finally, I'll say that the outcomes matter, and if we can have a patent buyout that similar to the Tamiflu example that Prof. Jomo has mentioned, or a production license, or any legal maneuver. I'm not wedded to a legal maneuver. I think all solutions needs to be on the table with tiered pricing in place, and with various pay for performance and risk sharing and innovative financing mechanisms for medicines in place as well. So that we broaden the conversation instead of only speaking narrowly about patents. Prof. Ida, thank you again. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khor. In fact, you have sort of concluded the whole discussion in a very refined manner. And I'm so sorry to have to cut short the discussion. The discussion has just becoming more heaty, but time is not in our favor. And here in Gombak, it's raining very heavily, and I'm worried that I might be cut off suddenly. Out of a sudden, I'll disappear from the screen. And with that, I would like to give my warmest thanks to the 4 panelists for agreeing to appear in this webinar, even though it's such a short time frame. Prof. Jomo, Dr. Chris, Dr. Khor, and Siti Munirah. I'm sure the discussion will not end here. Discussion at the international level is still ongoing. And as long as this pandemic is not over, we still have to think harder and harder on the best way to move forward and how to make the vaccine accessible to everybody around the world. Like most of you, I'm still also waiting for my vaccine, and I'm a bit disappointed that the supply of vaccines is pretty slow in Malaysia. So with that, I end this webinar with Wabillahi Taufiq wa Hidayah. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. And thank you to all the panelists. Can the panelists stay back for a photo session?
Okay.
Yes? Okay. And for the others that wants to take a photo, it's also fine. You can switch on your camera. I think I said it too late. Some have left already. So Damia, can take a photo, please. Take some photos, please. Yes. Damia? Is Damia around?
Yes, I'm around, bro.
Okay, all right.
Get ready. 1, 2, 3. Wait, yeah. Another one. Ready. 1, 2, 3.
Maybe the participants as well, switch on your computer if you want to have a photo with the panelists.
I hope Dr. Hemingway doesn't get into trouble for advertising.
I wasn't planning to be at home today, so we had actually a COVID case on our floor, so I had to kind of quickly. I should have put my head here, shouldn't I? Hiding the background.
There's quite a storm here. You can hear the storm.
Yeah,
I thought it was sound effects for our meeting.
After this, you can hear the azan. The mosque is just next to my office.
Okay.
Is that over, Damia?
Yes, Prof. Done, ready?
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Prof. Jomo. Thank you, Prof. Ida.
Thank you,
Dr. Khor,
thank you,
Dr.
everybody.
Chris, and everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. All right.
I managed to resist making jokes about Hemingway's namesake. I greatly appreciate.
Oh yeah, the actor. Wow.
No.
Oh yeah.
The Nobel laureate.
Nobel laureate.
Prof, you'll be pleased to know I'm not related.
Too bad. I'm sure people will be queuing to get your signature.
Yeah. I think the children are now trying to get in. I've been in here for too long, by the sounds of it.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Thank you again. Assalamualaikum.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you, Dr. Chris. Thank you, Dr. Khor. Thank you, Prof. Jomo, and thank you, Munirah, for everything.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you all.
Right.